All right, so welcome everyone. This is our Praxis Ideas Festival, and I think a lot is germinating from the meetings we've had so far, the discussions. It's quite exciting. So today we have Richard Heinberg back for a discussion, and as many of you know, he's the author of 13 books. He's a senior fellow at the Post-Carbon Institute in Santa Rosa, and we're going to talk a lot about the ideas in his new book, which is Power, Limits, and Prospects for
Human survival.
Right, for humanity, and for prospects for humanity. So I'm in the midst of that right now and highly recommend the book. And I put in the chat box, and John will put it in again for those of you who haven't seen it, a link to our local bookstore to be able to pick up that book. I'm halfway through now and I'm just riveted by it and I'm learning a lot too. And I love the context that you create for the information you're imparting, Richard. It's very exciting, and one can learn a lot from it and remember because of all these different connections. So I wanted to start the discussion. Well, there are two things I thought about starting it. One, in fact, I'm going to go to this one because it's not what we discussed before, but I want your opinion on it. When I was looking at something on YouTube the other day, you know how they have that list of things on the side that you can click on afterwards to watch? Well, one of them was Johnny Carson interviewing Carl Sagan. And I thought, oh, I've got to see this. So I looked at it, and it was what he was predicting 25 years ahead, and how astonishing it was, how right he has been. And one of the last things he said that really struck me, especially what we've just gone through in the last few years. He said he predicted a future where ignorance would be celebrated.
Whoa.
Sorry to start with that, but I thought, I'd like you to comment on that before we get into ideas in your book.
Yeah, well, as we reach the sort of turning point in the trajectory we've been on, and just to review, that basic trajectory is 200 years of cheap energy from fossil fuels that have enabled us to do everything that we want to do faster and a larger scale. That trajectory this century is shifting to a process of shrinkage, societal shrinkage. Everything is going to be harder to do. We will have less energy, regardless of what we do, how many solar panels we build, and so on. The reality is we're looking at a future of less energy, which means things are going to be harder to do and slower, and we'll need to do them on a smaller scale. So we're not prepared for that. We've gone through decades and decades of always expecting to have more, and we've created this whole mythology. Talk about Carl Sagan. Well, the mythology that we live by is the mythology of Star Trek.
Yes.
That even if we use up this planet, it's no problem because we'll just jet off to other planets and extract their resources. There's always going to be more, there will always be growth. And so we haven't prepared ourselves for an inevitable future, whether it begins, in 2025 or 2035 or 24, doesn't matter. The overall trajectory is what's important. We haven't prepared ourselves for the inevitable future when this process of growth turns around. And as we make the turn, we're seeing more and more turbulence. And that turbulence is taking economic forms, it's taking political forms, geopolitical forms, and social, everyone is upset because their expectations are not being met. And of course, what we've done, especially for the last 10 years, is instead of taking the abundance that we had and investing it in all of the things that will help to make the downslope smoother and more survivable and more equitable, we've spent that last 10 years in profit taking. So the billionaire class has, run off with all of the excess, the profits, and everybody else has just been treading water or losing ground. So that just by itself creates more social distress There's been a lot of really good social science research in the last 10 years showing the historic correlation between increasing inequality and the rise of authoritarianism and social instability. So of course, that's what we're seeing. So you started by talking about the celebration of ignorance. Well, that's a symptom, because people think, well, it's the smart people who've got us into this mess. The smart people have been in charge and telling us that they're going to solve all of our problems. And yet we see that we feel this increasing inequality in terms of our lives getting harder, and it feels more unfair, and the smart people aren't solving it. So what do we have to turn to something else. We have to turn to, some populist authoritarian leader who's going to, claim to be able to not necessarily solve all our problems, but at least make us feel better by, demonizing all these people who've been lording it over us for all this time.
Right.
So yeah.
Just gonna let someone in here.
Yeah,
That
please.
brings me to what you just said is one of the reasons why we read Hannah Arendt this year, The Origins of Totalitarianism, and how it feeds right into what we've experienced with the Trump and MAGA, whatever that group is, cult. It was as relevant today as it was 70 years ago, whenever she wrote it. One thing I want to ask you before I open it up for everyone else to ask questions is, the idea that we are going to be, again, taking minerals out of countries that we shouldn't be extracting from, and we're already doing that in Bolivia and other places. And that will be needed for the batteries for storing electricity. So with that happening on one side, the other problem that seems to be happening with the massive ignorance that we do have is that the quick fixes are going to come in, and geoengineering, creating different weather patterns. This is what scares me. What is your take on the control of weather to block out the sun, and what that could do to the planet?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's very risky because we're already tampering with the chemistry of the Earth's atmosphere and oceans, and the results are not. Obviously, we did not foresee the results, and the results are catastrophic. So, who was it said? Eric Severide said the main cause of problems is solutions, which sounds ridiculous when you first hear it. But, when human beings try to solve problems, inevitably, whatever they do, it's going to have some unintended consequences. So if it's at a small scale, well, we react to those consequences, and we keep going. And that's why we have traditional ways of living, because over time, people figure out the ways of living that are most sustainable and have the fewest unintended consequences. But if you're just living on the edge and doing things that have never been done before at an enormous scale, you're going to have unintended consequences also at an enormous scale. And what do you do about that? So I'm even in the best case, in the very best case, geoengineering could prevent the worst impacts of climate change. But then, what about all the rest? One of my criticisms of the environmental movement these days is that it has become just single-minded around climate change, and it's forgotten that we're presiding over a biological holocaust, with 70% of the Earth's wildlife having disappeared in the last 50 years. And we could go on, resource depletion, other pollution issues, and so on. So even if we fix climate change or the impacts of climate change with geoengineering, there's maybe we've bought ourselves 5 years or 10 years, and that's the best that will do. The only thing that's really going to get us out of this is to change that overall trajectory I was talking about earlier.
Right. It's like rationing with putting masks on our desires. I want to open it up now for anyone who wants to ask a question or make a comment or get Richard's ideas on a particular topic. I see Rocky
Thank you.
and then David. So Rocky.
Richard, it's very easy for us to chart the amount of carbon increase in the atmosphere year after year. And we can also compare that with the temperature increase here at the level of Earth. When will we actually hit temperatures on the Earth that will be in the 130s?
Mhm. Yeah, well, that's not that far away in some places,
Gotcha.
Places in the Middle East,
Uh-huh.
where temperatures have been nudging up against that level already. And what happens, of course, is that people in those areas will either die or move. And you think we've got an immigration problem now in Europe and North America and other places. Well, just wait. So we'd better figure that out. We'd better figure out, well, what we really want to do about immigration. And I think it's a challenging subject. It's not, most people either fall on one side or the other. More immigration is better, more diversity, fine. Let's welcome everyone. That's on one side, and the other side says, oh, those immigrants they're rapists and criminals, and we have to build a wall and do whatever it takes to keep them out. I think we're going to have to get more creative than that.
Yeah.
The English are a good example, though, Richard. When Brexit first went in, they thought they'd have somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000 Muslims actually immigrate to London, and as you can see, a bit time down the road, London now has mosques all over the place.
Yeah.
So, okay, I want to go to David.
Yeah, Richard, we got a lot of reason to be pretty depressed. And, if people ask me, do I really think we're going to make it through this? My reasoned answer is no, we're done. But somehow I have a hard time accepting that as what we ought to be preparing for our funerals. And I'd like to think there's just some possibility that if we really got our act together, if we really realize the power that we have as a species to make choices with the potential to change very rapidly, not that it's easy, but it is within our means. What are your solutions? What are the things that we should be applying ourselves to while we hopefully may still have a little time?
Right. Well, in the book, in the last chapter, I suggest that what we need is a kind of anti-collapse coalition.
Mm-hmm.
So all of the groups that are working on self-limitation of power in some way need to work together. Now, what does that look like? Self-limitation means self-limitation in terms of wealth disparity. So people who are working on eliminating or reducing economic inequality. It means anti-war or weapons control. It means in reducing
radical idea.
Yeah, reducing energy usage and carbon emissions. It means reducing the vertical political power that runs the world today, which is based on threats and bribes, incessant monetization of every human activity, which tends to create winners and losers very predictably, as it always has through human history. So in favor of more of a horizontal kind of social power where we make decisions collectively and together and on the basis of everyone's best interest as opposed to those who are able to control the threats and bribes. So in brief, that's what we have to do in order to get to the best possible outcome. Mm-hmm. And there's lots of detail in that. I mean, obviously, we're going to have to rethink a lot of of how we do things in very practical ways. Our food system, our energy system, of course, with climate change, how we make things, shortening supply chains so that we're relocalizing economies. All of these are aspects of the kind of transition that will have to take place in order to get to the optimum outcome. Now, there are those who say anything short of maintaining our current way of life by other means is failure. To them, it's like we've got to have more economic growth and more electronic goodies and more Hollywood blockbuster comic book movies and all of this stuff, because that's what's important. And we'll just do it with solar panels. If that's the definition of success, then I don't think there's any hope at all. But if we're willing and able to reconceive the human project along the lines I've just been talking about, then there's no reason we couldn't actually improve human life and human experience and our relationship with nature and the success of other species as we're making this transition.
Does anyone else want to ask something?
David?
Oh, no, I already got David.
Oh, well, his
Linda's
hand's
raising
up.
her hand.
Pardon?
Yeah, but Linda's raising her hand.
Okay, Linda, yes.
I listened to Humanity Rising today, where Roger Hallam was the main speaker.
Mhm.
And I've listened to Roger Hallam a lot. And, I'm finally beginning to think that together with your idea of building horizontal power, I'm beginning to see that maybe it really is direct action as well as what he's suggesting in terms of citizen assemblies. The thing that bothers me, though, is on the left, we really don't, we were talking about this with Georgia, I guess, and David on Saturday. We don't really have on the left think tanks. We don't have idea generations for these citizen assemblies for thinking through. I mean, we can raise all the awareness possible with people out on the streets saying, we can't handle this, we're 130 degree, finally people are going to wake up. I don't know when it's going to happen, but it's going to happen pretty soon. But then if we don't have some kind of well thought through plan, that's what bothers me, kind of like the Arab Spring. It turned out to be collapsed into an authoritarian regime because they didn't have it thought through. What are some of your thoughts about the lack of having think tanks and direct
Right.
action, and then what?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think direct action is really important. And, that's only one of the prongs of the effort that needs to take place. Another significant, important prong is building alternative ways of living.
Right.
Because let's just suppose that the climate change activism is successful. What's the aim? To get us off fossil fuels as soon as possible. We'll defeat the oil companies and coal, and all fossil fuels go away next year. What would happen? Billions of people would die. That's what would happen. Because we're depending on those fossil fuels for real practical services that not only maintain the economy, but feed people and supply all the things we need. So unless we have other people who are actually, putting in some effort, finding alternative low energy ways of meeting basic human needs, just protesting is not enough.
Right. But in your mind, who is going to help us lead through to to the other side? I mean, we talked with David on Saturday, and David, I love your vision for the future, but how is that going to be made possible? Who's going to step in other than some kind of fascist authoritarian type? And then they're just going to hold on to power. They're not going to want to move into that new realm.
Yeah, I know. See, this is the paradox that we're dealing with. As I talk about in the book, there's a lot of social science research that's going on in the last decade or two, showing that people with a lot of social power are debilitated by it in various predictable ways. Their sense of empathy tends to recede. Their ability to assess risk tends to go away, their ability to see things from other people's point of view. So the people in charge in our society right now, and the people who are negotiating at COP26 and so on, are people with social power who suffer from exactly these, these debilitating conditions. And they're the ones that we're depending on to be able to solve these problems. And they're exactly the wrong people. So, but then on the other hand, if you say, well, then it's up to the rest of us, it's up to ordinary people. Well, how do we do that? We don't have the social means, we don't have the intellectual capital in many cases, and so on to do that. So, you know, all of that is going to have to be constructed, not exactly from scratch, because we have bits and pieces of it already lying around here and there. But we're really going to have to build a lot of that ASAP.
Right, fast.
Yeah.
Getting
This
brightest and-
anti-collapse coalition has really got to get together. I mean, I thought that was a brilliant idea when Richard mentioned it before and in his book, that this is could be a way to bring groups together to actually.
I'm not sure that's the best name for it, and
Maybe
I don't.
not, but
And
it's,
I'm not proposing myself as a leader for it,
No.
nor do I think we need, you know, a big leader, even Greta,
Right.
dear as she is, you know, but something along the lines that I'm talking about needs to happen if we're going to get through it.
we need kind of a horizontal leadership. And
Right.
I think where I've learned a lot about that is at Mondragon, because they do
Yeah.
have managers, they have people in charge, but they're not power kind of people. They're not people who are authoritarian over other people. It's just their managerial work is for efficiency. It's not for power over. And it's a very different
Right.
model.
Well, it's a call back really to hunter-gatherer ethics,
Yes,
where,
yeah.
you know, within hunter-gatherer societies, some people are respected for their knowledge, for example, about local geography. Where do we go next? Well, talk to him, he knows, or
Right.
her, or knowledge of herbs, or experience with this, or a special ability with that. But that doesn't mean that they get to call the shots
Right.
in other areas or, you know. So
Yeah, that's the way they do it there.
Yeah.
Democratically, one vote, one person. It's a very democratic process. Learned a lot from that. And I think those are the kinds of models that we could learn from creating regional organizations as well as coalitions. So Fran, I
Yeah.
think she wants to say something. Fran?
Hi, Richard. Lovely
Hello,
to
Fran.
see you on this. So I associate your name years ago, most prominently with the idea of peak oil.
Mhm.
And yet today, it seems like we have way too much oil and we're trying to stop people from even accessing it. So help me understand how you see that trajectory and our fear at one point of peak oil and where we stand now, where we seem to have too much.
Mhm.
Help me understand how you see that.
Sure. Well, the whole peak oil discussion, I think, was a really important one in that it got people to thinking about the process of resource depletion and the fact that non-renewable resources are finite, and extracting them at an ever higher rate is a ticket to catastrophe, right? So it's true with oil, coal, natural gas, iron ore, copper, neodymium, you know, whatever resource you're talking about, or renewable resources if you're extracting them faster than they can regrow. So that was an important part of the conversation. It was also helpful in terms, I think, of helping people understand the importance of energy per se, and especially of fossil fuels and what fossil fuels have done to or for human society, because we just take that for granted. We assume it's a given, but it's not a given. You know, everything has changed in the last 200 years as a result of fossil fuels. So that was important. Now, where the peak oil discussion unfortunately failed was in specific predictions of when global oil production would peak. And the thought was it would probably be between 2005, 2010, somewhere in that range. Well, in 2005, regular conventional oil production did hit a plateau, and it's still on that plateau. It hasn't really increased since 2005. But what has happened instead is that we've seen a very substantial increase in unconventional oil, and 90% of that increase has come from horizontal drilling and hydrofracturing of light tight oil here in the United States. So we're talking about the Bakken, the Permian play in Texas, and so on. And we've done a lot of original research on that subject that you can find at postcarbon.org. We have a geoscientist named David Hughes, who used to work for the Canadian government and has done some just stellar work in looking at what are the characteristics, prospects, and so on of tight oil and shale gas also, which uses the same technology, and again has been applied mostly here in the U.S. And these are very drilling intensive plays because the gas and oil are locked up in tight rocks, usually shale, not always, but rock that has very low permeability. So that's why horizontal drilling and hydrofracturing, exploding the rock to release the oil and gas is necessary. But then all of the fuel comes out very quickly, over the first 3-4 years. So then that's why it's so drilling intensive and investment intensive. And that's why it's more polluting, because you're doing all of this on a much higher scale. So I think the peak oil discussion has helped us understand a lot of that. It's also helped us understand that the process of depletion works by the low-hanging fruit principle. So we always get the cheap, easy stuff first. And that was the conventional oil that did level off at 2005. But the unconventional stuff that we're getting now takes more effort, more investment, and is more environmentally ruinous. And that's true as time goes on with new increments of coal production, natural gas production as well. And the world is starting to bump up against those supply limits. And we're seeing very high oil prices right now, very high natural gas prices, high coal prices globally. And it's partly due to, and I have an essay on this right at richardheinberg.com right now, but it's partly due to, transient market conditions. But it's partly just due to the fact that we have a situation where prices for these fuels are tending increasingly to be too high for consumers, which makes the economy less stable, and not high enough for producers because all the cheap, easy stuff is gone. So, it can't be increased. And so if we want more oil, gas, or coal, we've got to go after the stuff that's harder and more expensive to produce. So as we enter that gap of, the disappearing Goldilocks price, works for both producers and consumers, the whole system starts to come apart. And those who focus only on climate change miss this whole dimension. They just write it off with the saying, well, our problem is not that we don't have enough oil, it's that we have too much. Okay, at one level that's true, but we need those fossil fuels, and we need them in stable supply in order to build all those wind turbines and solar panels and batteries and electric cars and so on that we're going to need if we make the transition, because 85% of our energy is coming from fossil fuels. So if we're going to build all that stuff, it's going to take a lot of energy. And where are we going to get it from? So if we've waited too long, and I think this is mostly the case, if we've waited too long to make the transition, if we've waited to the point where fossil fuels are getting less stable in supply, then that makes the transition that much harder. And it's one more argument for not just assuming that the transition is to, the same way of life we have today, consumerism, growth, et cetera, only with renewable energy instead of oil. That's just unrealistic. The reality is it's a transition from more and more and more to less and less and less. And if we get that through our heads, then we can make the transition in a more reasonable and fair way, hopefully.
You know, that brings me something that I wanted to ask in relationship to what you were just saying earlier about the transition, meaning that there would be loss of jobs during a transition. And I'm curious as to what that would look like as fossil fuels are used less and we're transitioning to alternative energy sources. What would be the gap? I mean, can you give some idea what you think that gap would be and how many jobs might be lost approximately, what that looks like?
Yeah, that gets very difficult because you have to look at different scenarios. And we're not just facing one universal scenario. It could be very different in different places, depending on policy and so on. I mean, you could look at the end of cheap energy as a jobs creation program. Mm-hmm. Because all of this stuff has been done with cheap energy. You know, all of us use powered machinery 24 hours a day these days, and we just take it for granted, like these computers that we're all looking into right now. And that's replacing human labor in various ways. It's replacing handwriting notes and sending them to each other, you know, and all kinds of other things. So if we have less energy for machines, that could mean we need more people using their muscle power to do stuff to solve human problems and supply human needs. That's one way it could work out. The other way is a market failure, where because the machines stop working, then the economy just shudders and creaks and groans and starts to collapse, and investors flee and debts are suddenly revealed as unrepayable. The financial system collapses and nobody has any money with which to hire other people. So, you know, suddenly millions of jobs just disappear. It could go either way or both in different places and at different times.
Yeah, I think we're seeing a little bit of each. And a lot of the places around here, and I think everywhere I've gone recently, there are help wanted signs in so many windows of businesses. I think it's given people through the COVID era a lot of time to reassess where they're putting their energy and if it's worth it. I think that's part of it. I mean, there are other parts too, but it feels like people had time. It's like a timeout that we've been able to reassess. And if there isn't another question right now, I wanted to bring up something that I spoke to you about before we began the session today. And it's really off topic from where we've just been, but it's definitely part of your book, and a very important part, I think, is the focus you put on beauty and the role that plays in our lives, and the role it can play, I think, in bringing us to a place of understanding that we have to have less. Beauty, I think, can actually do that. So can the discipline that you and I spoke about in learning to play an instrument. There's a discipline that you have to master an instrument. And without it, it's an everyday practice. And without it, you will never reach that plateau. So I want you to connect a little bit, the discipline that goes with a artistic practice and beauty, and how you see that as a possible way of enlightening humanity. Yeah, well, this, you know, beauty figures in the book in a lot of contexts throughout the book, but it starts in a discussion of evolution, and I was powerfully affected by a book that I read 3 or 4 years ago called "The Evolution of Beauty" by a Yale ornithologist, and he went back to Darwin's second book. Of course, Darwin's first great book was Origin of Species, but the second book was on sexual selection. And Darwin was very troubled by the peacock's tail, because the peacock invests all this evolutionary effort and energy in creating this beautiful tail, but from a natural selection perspective, you'd think that was a huge mistake, because it makes it harder for the peacock to fly. It makes it more obvious to predators and so on. So what's the payoff? Well, the payoff is in sexual selection, because the female peacock
then gets to decide which male, she wants to mate with. And so the males all have this arms race to produce the most beauty. And the thing is, it's not just in peacocks. This is going on everywhere in nature, in flowering plants, in birds, in insects. Nature is furiously producing and intentionally producing beauty at every scale, on every hand. And it's not just beauty in some subjective term. You go out and look at its sunset and you think, oh, that's nice, but it's just what it is. No, beauty is part of evolution. It's part of human evolution. And of course, humans invest enormous amounts of effort in making beauty, but it's gotten hijacked by commerce. And in evolution, there's what's called aesthetic degeneracy, in the sense that if the production of beauty, if the evolution of the production of beauty goes on too far in one direction, it can do what Darwin was afraid would be happening with peacocks. It could lead to the reduced viability of species. That's what apparently happened with the Irish elk. They started competing to grow bigger and bigger antlers, the males did. And at a certain point, the antlers became so big that it imperiled the survival of the species, and Irish elk are now extinct, largely as a result of that. Well, our human production of beauty has gotten hijacked by consumerism. And so what used to be a way of, in traditional human societies, the production of beauty was a way of taking surplus and investing it in things that improved the lives and the experience and the happiness of the community as a whole, and took that surplus away from activities that would have produced even more surplus, so that some people could get rich and start to control things and so on. It was a deliberate destruction of surplus. And so you had, seasonal feasts where capital is what an economist would call capital, was deliberately destroyed. Now we don't do that. We take our surplus capital and we reinvest it for more and more economic growth. And our artistic creativity is enlisted in more consumer spending, more growth, getting people, advertising art, getting people to buy stuff. It corrupts the whole artistic process. And in the book, I suggest, if we could free human aesthetic production from the commercial sphere once more and return it to its communitarian context, then life could be very beautiful. I mean, we could reduce our material throughput, our energy usage, the scale of our cities, and return to a way of life in which we're singing and dancing and making beautiful things and just enjoying the beauty of life to a much greater degree than we are right now.
Wonderfully put. Does anyone have anything they would like to say, ask? I'm looking for hands. I'm not seeing any.
Katie. has
Katie.
one.
Oh, Katie. Okay, Katie.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was just gonna thank you very much, Richard. This is scintillating, beyond fascinating, really an honor. I wanted to just ditto something Georgia brought up, which was an interesting piece about discipline. It made me think of Erich Fromm's ancient book, The Art of Loving, in the first page, in which he says, if you are reading this because you want to learn how to love somebody and you want it to be simple, just throw this book away, because loving is an art, and it's very much an art like playing the guitar or any other art. It takes discipline, and there were several other qualities. I don't have it in front of me, but I just want to say that I think that is a piece that we could keep in our minds for these discussions.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. That's beautiful. Yeah, a point that I make in the book over and over is that we've gotten very good at controlling nature and controlling other people.
Right. Good point.
But our greatest sense of fulfillment comes from self-control, learning how to control our own capacities. For example, playing a musical instrument, we talked about that example. It takes an enormous amount of self-control, discipline, spending the time, but learning how to use your muscles, your voice, or whatever it is that's making the music at ever and ever finer degrees. And that's would seem like a lot of work, putting thousands of hours into practicing. But the more you get into it, the more fulfilling it becomes. A life without that kind of self-discipline is really a hollow thing. So once again, this is the opportunity. And I quote, I don't know if I can find it right now, but ancient philosophers to the effect that power over others, that's a certain kind of strength. But self-control, power over yourself and your urges and your appetites and so on, that's true power.
I'd love to hear or see that quote at some point. It makes me just add that my passion is a lot around working with couples in conflict resolution, and absolutely self-regulation when it comes to anger is kind of a new concept, frankly, for almost everybody I work with. It's kind of it's quick, kind of shocking to see. Actually, they're like, really? Yeah. It needs to be taught.
I think discipline is something we have, I don't think, talked about in any of the programs we've done. And yet I certainly was reminded of it in reading your book, Richard, that this is really an important part of being able to do what we have to do to stop the continuous growth the trajectory that we're on. It is going to take self-discipline. And I think a lot of people are prepared for it and a lot of people are not. I mean, I'll go back to Carl Sagan's quote, the celebration of ignorance is not going to get us there. But anyway, I think it's an important piece, and I don't know if you have anything else you want to say about it, but I know you've spent years doing that. Yeah,
like anything, if you once you state a principle and you put it in words and make it in concretize it in that way, then it's possible to misinterpret it and misapply it. I mean, there are lots of ways that we use discipline, but in a way that's destructive, but the kind of self-discipline that we're talking about in the service of beauty and artistry and connection with others is, as we've been saying, is essential.
Yeah, we weren't talking about military discipline.
Yeah.
We're talking about artistic discipline, which it is that sort of thing that gives you an exhilarated feeling. I mean, you really feel very happy. Julie looks like she has something, and we'll probably finish soon. We'll finish by 5. So
yes, I would like to ask your opinion on China and the ever increasing products that are coming from China to all over the world, and all those ships at all the harbors that are just sitting there. Thank you.
Yeah, well, that's a big subject. China's been making all our stuff, and China is making all our solar panels right now, and China is making our solar panels using coal. So that's one of the great paradoxes of dealing with climate change. If it's obviously self-defeating. I mean, by building the solar panels, you're hopefully creating a more efficient energy system in the future that will use less coal. Then when we have all the solar panels installed, it's a path from here to there. But nevertheless, it's paradoxical and it's crazy. And we have, by offshoring to China, all this manufacturing stuff, we've hollowed out a lot of our own country. And I grew up in the Midwest in the United States. And there was a lot, when I was growing up, there was a lot of manufacturing there. And of course, there was a lot of agriculture too. And it was a pretty vital region. And I don't like going back to Northeast Missouri now to see what has become of folks there. You know, I mean, they're good people and well-meaning and everything, but it's just been pillaged. It's a shadow of its former self, and that's why people are up in arms, literally up in arms, and supporting crazy political movements and so on. So moving that manufacturing back onshore is really important. Shortening those supply chains for a number of reasons. Not just climate reasons, but also social and economic reasons is really important. China uses as much coal as the rest of the world put together.
That's sobering.
Yeah, that's sobering, and it's not going to change quickly. It's like a train, that has a lot of momentum. You can stop it, but it takes a while, and it takes distance to do it.
I think we'll take a last question from Ray.
Yes, Richard, hi. Just hearing what you were talking about and thinking about China, of course, it's one of those dynamics where we appreciated moving the manufacturing to China to shift the pollution to them instead of us. So that's good. And then we're learning that there is no capitalism like authoritarian capitalism, and the Chinese are the experts. So that's a scary thing that might be imported from them more than any hard goods. But what I'm thinking about is one thing that could help the U.S. is return to fundamentals. I mean, we've got Alexander Hamilton's treatise on the manufacturers, I think he called it, and defining how to make things here and anchor that prosperity in the development of the U.S. And I mean, we've got that's a pretty good document to start with, to do exactly what I think you're advocating. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we can call upon, ancient historic precedents and some sense of patriotism to accomplish it, great. My concern for the U.S. right now, frankly, is that we have squandered our sense of social cohesion. And that's really, really important as we're approaching a very, very difficult time of transition. If we don't have the social cohesion, then our prospects are not good. There are other countries that have fared much better during the pandemic simply because they had more social cohesion. And for them, the pandemic actually, because they saw how important it was to work together, it actually increased the level of cooperation. But here it's done just the opposite. And that's I'm sorry to say, that's sad and frightening to see, and it's not a good harbinger.
Well, you were talking about the activism that's required to kind of move things forward. And yes, that's well and good, but it seems like what we would be confronting is the activism on the right, which we just learned from the results of a certain trial, that they get to have the guns and they get to be the shock troops to battle against any sort of protest that they deem threatening. So that worries me more, I think, because that's the that's the insurrection of fascism that's looking to, grab power at any cost and then undermine, anything that we would view as, a vision going forward.
Yeah. Yeah. Right now, it just looks like you have two competing worldviews, and there's no way to move forward to solving our basic problems until one defeats the other. So everyone's, attention and effort is focused on, promoting my tribe and defeating the other tribe, and our attention is sapped away from what's really needed, which is to come together to solve the problems. And I don't know how to get around that. I think we're in for some difficult
Well,
days.
the fascists don't want to come together. So
I know.
that seems to be a not the best plan when there really is a divide of two sides, and one side, as you said, needs to be defeated. They don't need to be accommodated. So I'm kind of with Ben Boyce. I see he's not on here on that one.
Yeah, there was something. It was just, I think I wanted to mention, because we were talking about the COVID numbers. I think we've done very well in the Bay Area and most of California. And I'm just looking at the numbers for Sonoma County right now. We only have 1,223 people with COVID out of 500,000 people. So our numbers have really gone down. We're all in the green right now. So I think we've done a good job here in Sonoma and Marin and probably San Francisco. Everywhere I've gone there, people are wearing their masks indoors. There's really a conscientious effort. So I think we can't say our whole country is a problem. I think we've learned in certain areas.
Right. I mean, one scenario for the future would be the breakdown of the union and into smaller countries. I mean, I think that's actually a conceivable future.
Let the South secede.
Yeah. Well,
you think that could happen?
I think it could happen. Yes.
Katie has her hand up.
Okay, well, we're really kind of out of.
Yeah, we're running out the clock here. Maybe we should end on a.
Katie.
Yeah, we're running. Yeah, we're running out of time.
She's had her hand up for a bit.
Well, let Katie. Yeah, go ahead.
1 minute.
Let's make it short.
Yeah.
1 minute.
Yeah.
I want to thank you. I want to promote maybe a conversation amongst us about social cohesion and how to encourage that. There are books like Bowling Alone and Kleinenberg's Palaces for the People and many others that focus on this. So that's my nickel.
Good.
That's your nickel. Any last final words, Richard, from you? I want to plug the book again because I think everyone on this call, if you haven't bought the book.
I mean, I could go on and on. Writing this book was the intellectual adventure of my lifetime because the book covers so much territory. I wanted to get myself up to speed on all of these subjects. And I ended up reading, fascinating books about everything from cell biology to recent social science and on and on and on. And so in the book, you will find not just references to, but summaries of the work of a lot of really important scholars and researchers over the last decade or so.
You're going to send this to a lot of other authors as well.
Yeah, and so I recommend the book, if nothing else, just for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's the overview and the context is extraordinary. So highly recommend it. And thank you so much, Richard, for spending an hour with us and having a conversation and answering questions. It could go on forever, but
yeah, it's been very stimulating. Thank you. Yes. Thank you for organizing it, Georgia.
Absolutely. So thank you everyone for being here. We have a recording of it so we can also listen to it later. I'm going to end the recording now.